I was in the Army for 10 years. During that time, I traveled all over the world for deployments and training ops. I've seen a lot of bad shit the world has to offer, and a lot of good. I was an infantryman and sniper, and during my first deployment to Iraq, I spent a lot of time sitting on rooftops or inside abandoned buildings. I would watch streets, city blocks, whatever, trying to pin down patterns of life, and get a better idea of what was happening out in the sector. Often my 3-man team would get attached to a line platoon and go out on 24 to 48-hour missions to get eyes on an intersection or building where we suspected the enemy moved. 99% of the time, everything went according to plan. We'd either spend all day looking at nothing, we'd get compromised at the break of dawn and get into a day-long gunfight. Or if we were really lucky, we would get the drop on the bad guys and end up ambushing them. A couple times though, things would happen that really defied logic or expectation. Now understand, throughout this period of my life, I was almost always sleep deprived, hungry, and under extreme levels of stress. I don't discount the idea that at least some of what I experienced was due to the above factors playing tricks on my mind or whatever. Oh. Also, I've had 1 or 2 paranormal experiences from before the Army. Don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but worth mentioning. One day in Baghdad, we were on foot patrol to check out a part of our sector we rarely went to, not for any specific reason. The bad guys never went there, so we never went there. The whole area, about 3 city blocks, had been a Christian neighborhood before the fall of Saddam. But after law and order broke out down completely, the Christians were either forced out or murdered. We were just going from building to building at night, checking things out. We found this one house with a room on the roof that had been built separately from the main structure, which in and of itself was pretty common. What was strange with this room is that it had a door that was locked from the inside. It was a sheet metal door with a hand latch on the inside which you could lock with a padlock. For some reason this intrigued me, and I had an urge to find out what was in there. So we proceeded to go to town on this door with our breaching kit. It took about 20 minutes of solid work, but before we yanked this fucking door open. First off, at this point I'm a seasoned combat soldier. Seen some shit, did some shit. I'm not easily spooked. This room, however, scared the fuck out of me as soon as we opened the door. There was a single hallway leading back to a T section. It was pitch black, and the smell wafting out of there was like a butcher shop. Blood, raw meat. My hackles were up at attention at this point. We entered slowly and spread out to check the structure. There were several rooms, all with dried blood covering the floor, smears on the wall. It was evident that some horrific shit happened in here. The last room contained an old metal bed frame with leather straps and wires running off to the opposite corner with a car battery set. Also, there was an oppressive heaviness in the whole place, like the air had weight to it. We got the fuck out of there as quickly as we could. The strangest part was that it was locked with a padlock and deadbolted from the inside. There was absolutely no other way out beside the door. No windows, just one door, locked from the inside. We never figured that one out, but I still think about it all the time. That same night, we found another house locked from the inside. Bullet holes all over the walls, and "Please God help us" written over and over on the wall in Arabic. The words were written in red ink, and I swear to God one of the words was dripping wet red down the wall. Our interpreter said it was a bad place, and we got the fuck back to the COP as quickly as possible. During the Afghan winter, the war basically shuts down, and everyone takes a breather till spring and summer. The Taliban go into Pakistan to rearm and collect new recruits. That doesn't change the fact that the patrols still need to go out there and conduct the business of war. So my patrol gets this mission to take out striker APCs and post up at a base up some of the hills on the Afghan-Paki border. We're told that we would be there for 3 days tops. It ended up being 2 weeks before the helicopters came and pulled us out. The second night we were there, a massive snowfall happened and over 2 feet of snow dropped. We were basically snowed in. Our 4 vehicles were in a wagon wheel, asses in, noses out, in a circle to watch all angles of approach. Someone was always on guard in each of the trucks, scanning their sector with thermals and night optics. So there we were, stuck with nothing to do. The first day after the snowstorm, which lasted 2 days, I lowered the ramp of my vehicle, and I saw fresh prints weaving in and out of our perimeter, coming from outside up the hill. Whoever was walking around was barefoot. Naturally, I'm creeped out. No one was outside during the snow, except to use the restroom, and all of their tracks were easily identified. The mysterious tracks kept showing up randomly the whole time we were out there. Eventually, I took a small patrol up the hill following the tracks that always led down, but never came back up. We got to the top of the hill and the tracks just ended. No explanation given. When we got pulled out, I took a couple of the other platoon's NCOs aside and warned them, but they just shrugged it off. By the time they got back 2 weeks later, they all acted like nothing had happened out there. But one soldier came up to me and told me the tracks kept showing up every morning fresh. There were even muddy bare footprints found covering the tops of trucks and strikers. Around the fall of 2008, we were back from Iraq trying to settle back into the garrison's mindset, dial things back a notch as it were. Everyone was waiting to go back on block leave for 30 days and come back ready for round 2. It was during that time I got promoted to sergeant and put in charge of my first fire team. Part of every new NCO's duty is to provide beer for a platoon-wide officer professional development class, which is basically an excuse for all the sergeants to get blasted together and swamp stories, share advice, whatever, that sort of stuff. One of the senior guys in my company had been in the army for quite a while. He had been to Somalia for Black Hawk Down, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Desert Storm, before OIF and OEF. He told me about waiting on the Saudi side of the berm, waiting to go into Iraq, stealth fighters and bombers flying by overhead to knock out Iraqi army positions. The War of the Paladins unleashing their missiles against unexpected armored infantry units miles away. They waited in that desert for 6 months, before finally crossing into Kuwait. By the time they got there, the war was pretty much over. He was with an armored cavalry unit and saw some limited action, mainly against poorly trained and equipped conscript units and ancient Soviet tanks. The American war machine swept over these poorly defended positions easily, and within 72 hours, the ground war was over. Now, I know everyone has seen Jarhead and seen the news footage of the Highway of Death. My buddy wasn't involved in that part of the ground action. His unit was part of the Anvil. The retreating Iraqis hit during their flight from Kuwait. After everything was said and done, they spent the next few months on the ground, basically cleaning everything up. He told me stories about clearing Iraqi bunkers and trench complexes, sifting through the remains of entire companies wiped out in bombings and whatsoever. Up to this point, what he described was pretty typical of a major ground action. But I still can't imagine finding myself in the position of being a major in a conventional war. He went on to describe one day in particular towards the end of his time on the ground. They woke up from their hastily dug fighting positions in the middle of the desert. They wiped the grime out of their eyes and ate a quick MRE and trucked to a destroyed Iraqi radar site. His platoon was tasked with collecting any intelligence they might find and collecting dog tags off of the corpses that littered what seemed to be the entire Kuwaitian desert. They still had to be careful. A handful of guys had already been killed by booby traps that the Iraqis strung up before retreating. They arrived on site and started their sweep. There were dozens of charred corpses scattered around outside. The site was a relatively deep and well-constructed bunker that contained the CP, and a trench line about 100 meters long. Strewn about were pictures of wives and kids, personal effects, letters, and books. Anything that had been destroyed in the bombing was collected up by the troops as war trophies are brought back to base for analysis. They arrived on site and started their sweep. There were dozens of charred corpses scattered around outside. The site was a relatively deep and well-constructed bunker that contained the CP, and a trench line about 100 meters long. Strewn about were pictures of wives and kids, personal effects, letters, and books. Anything that had been destroyed in the bombing was collected up by the troops as war trophies or brought back to base for analysis. He found himself alone, down in the bunker. It was a rectangular concrete box, with a machine gun slit in the front. Think of the movie Saving Private Ryan. The roof was half collapsed, with a large hole punched through it where the bunker buster had burrowed down and incinerated the occupants. There was a dead Iraqi slumped across a DSS-HK machine gun, basically the Soviet version of the American 50 cal. He said even then, he got a really creepy vibe down there. Aside from the dead gunner, there were the remains of at least 3 others in there, but they were closer to being atomized. They must have been directly underneath the bomb when it fell. My buddy quickly snatched the machine gunner's dog tags off his neck, stuffed them in his pocket, and left back to the surface. Some guys had a pile of dog tags, others only had a few. My buddy had one set he found on the machine gunner. He went on to tell some friends about how creepy it had been in the bunker, and how he felt kinda bad for the gunner, manning his position to the last, maybe covering his buddy's retreat in the face of the Americans. One of my friends asks, "What machine gunner?" He had been down there in the bunker and hadn't seen any bodies down there. Thinking his friend was mistaken, maybe there was a different bunker we hadn't seen. He went back for lunch to make sure. He stepped down into the bunker and sure enough, there was the machine gun. But there was no gunner. He said at this point his hair was standing on end. He was sure the dead guy had been there. That's when he noticed the drag marks through the charred soil. The footsteps led across the floor and up to the steps to the surface. He followed them out away from the fighting position about 50 meters. Laying in the sand was the gunner. His body was frozen in a slow crawl position, left leg straight back, right knee cocked up, with his left arm reaching forward and raised off the ground, as if reaching for something, maybe a way home. He assumed one of the sick fuckers in his platoon had moved the body, but when he asked, no one fessed up to it. On the drive back, he realized the gunner had been facing towards the Iraqi border. Our sector was a large chunk of the southern part of Baghdad, strictly urban, with the majority of the buildings being 2 to 3 story residential houses. The bad guys had absolute control of the northern tip of Out sector. We controlled the south, and everything in between was gray space we fought over. There was a lot of sectarian violence going on, Sunni killing Shia, with decapitated bodies showing up daily on street corners. Anyway, given the nature of the fighting going on, almost all of the civilian population had evacuated months or years prior, leaving a whole city abandoned. It was eerie, walking around on patrol in a totally empty, silent city. Most of the houses were still full of stuff from the people that either evacuated or were dead, and as mentioned above, we could occupy the house and wait for a fight. One night, I'm on guard in one of these abandoned houses. There, 2 guys on the team were racked out on the floor. The rest of the platoon were spread out in different rooms, and on the ground floor. It was the middle of night, and all I could think about was smoking a cigarette, which is an absolute no-no at night. I decided to sneak a can of dip from my buddy's can of Copenhagen. I grabbed the can, and I proceeded to pack it, which for anyone that doesn't know, involves holding the can and kinda shaking it while loosening your index finger, which hits the top of the can, making a slapping sound. Probably not the brightest thing to do in the middle of the night on an OP, but I needed the nicotine to stay awake. Anyway, I'm packing the can, and I start to notice a strange echo. Like every time I pack the can, I hear an identical slap. but delayed enough that I know for a fact that it isn't an echo off the wall or something. This goes on for like 30 seconds. As my sleep-deprived mind couldn't fully grasp what was happening, just me packing a can of dip, while some weird phantom echo mimics me. Suddenly I see a movement from the corner of my eye inside the room. I look over, and there was a picture frame floating about 10 inches off the desk it had been on. Without taking my eyes off the picture, I watched as the frame suddenly fell out of the air and broke on the floor. I chalked it up to hallucinations from no sleep, but the next morning I took a look in the daylight, and the picture frame's outline was clearly visible in the dust that had settled on the desk. Here's another story my buddy told me that really stood out. At some point he had been stationed at Fort Irwin, California, the home of the National Training Center. The site is basically a massive desert that stretches from California to Nevada, including parts of Death Valley National Park. Edwards Air Force Base and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory are either connected as part of the train area or within spitting distance. His job while stationed there was to serve as an opposing force, the bad guys for when we play war with Miles' gear. Part of his training was IED construction, guerrilla warfare tactics, etc. The nature of his position had him outside most days and nights, during train rotations, either lying in ambush or sneaking around. He told me that there were parts of training area no one went to simply because the area was so vast and desolate. But to kill time and doing what bored soldiers do, fucking off, they often drove out to random spots in the desert. He is a firm believer in aliens after seeing some of the things he did out there on the edge of civilization. Aircraft that could stop on a dime in midair, completely silent, able to pop out of existence overhead and reappear on the horizon. I tried telling him it was probably some experimental drone or something, but he says he's convinced it's aliens. He also told me about the time his squad had to escort a dude in khakis and a polo with a briefcase out to the middle of fucking nowhere. There was an antenna array at the base of some hills. The way he described it, it looked like a row of identical monolithic satellite dishes. He said there was a single building, like a utility hut. That's where they dropped the guy off. He unlocked the door and went inside. That was that. He was nice during the drive down apparently, but as they pulled up, he leaned forward and patted my buddy on the shoulder and said, "You were never here, right, Chief?" So, eventually I found myself in Afghanistan. My company was broken up by platoons, and each platoon was stuck on their own outpost in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan. We were down south on the Afghanahab River, which was used as a rat line, smuggling weapons and fighters south from Pakistan into Kandahar province. Our job was to interdict the smuggling and try to disrupt their movement. I can't vouch for others that have been there, but to me, Afghanistan was a spooky place, especially at night. Where I was, there was a huge mountain range behind our outpost, and we were kind of situated on the slope. The ground sloped down to the river, then shot back up the opposite side. All the villages were down along the riverbanks, where farmers could work their crops. There was absolutely no light pollution, and we were at a reasonably high elevation, so lots of nights I would lay out on top of the bunker and look at the stars. When the moon was full, the river was illuminated like a silver ribbon, cutting through the valley. Occasionally I would see shapes moving around by the water, but no biggie. Probably farmers working in the cool night, as opposed to the blistering heat of the day. There was a platoon of Navy SEALs that lived on the base when we got there, and they pretty much told us not to patrol at night. The Afghan army guys that were with us always told us these crazy fucking stories about how the Taliban were wolves, or more specifically, werewolves. It sounded like total bullshit, but our interpreters always told us that it was true when we would laugh about it. Anyway, one night I'm up in the tower checking out the mountain with the CLU, the computer-assisted launch kit. but is CLU for short, which is the computer part of a Javelin missile. By itself, it's really useful as a night optic, as long as you don't have to haul it around. It's got great thermals and decent night amplification. Suddenly all the stray dogs we had living with us start going nuts and barking at the mountain. I'm thinking, this gonna be good. And there's obviously Taliban creeping around. I take a look with the CLU and see a thermal signature that looks like a man moving behind the rocks. He's poking his head out occasionally and looking in our direction. I can even make out his beard and some facial features. He dips down behind a rock and disappears, like the guy was gone. I scan around for a couple minutes looking for him, and just when I'm starting to get alarmed by his sudden disappearance, I see a blob of heat shoot up from behind the rock and come quickly down the slope towards us. I yell out and wake up the dude next to me. He gets on the 50 cal and starts lighting up the whole area. Eventually he shot off 60 to 70 rounds, and I explained what I saw. He laughed it off and called up the shooting as a test fire. This whole time the dogs are still barking. I am looking around my night vision, just in time to see a huge Afghan mountain dog loping off down the river behind us. In between my Iraq and Afghan deployments, my unit took part in a huge war game that takes place every couple of years, primarily in the Philippines, and around the whole Pacific region of Southeast Asia. It was descent training, and most importantly an opportunity to go to the Malaysian Jungle Warfare School. The school was about 3 weeks long, and except for the first day and last week, took place completely in the jungle. I'm talking triple canopy, raining constantly, almost pitch black during the day, and absolutely devoid of light after the sunset, to the point that night vision was completely useless, because there wasn't enough ambient light. Thankfully the school wasn't conducted under combat conditions, so we were able to string up hammocks at night and sleep off the ground. There were still always 2 people up at all times on watch for predators and occasional rebels. The instructors had live rounds to pass out in an event we ran into a rebel patrol, or something, which was very unlikely. So for at least 1 hour at night, I was up staring at literally nothing and listening to the fucking jungle sounds that never stopped, except 2 times. The first time it was like 1 to 2 a.m., dark as fuck, can't even see 2 inches in front of my face. Slowly I noticed the jungle noises taper off to almost absolute silence. Now I'm kind of freaking out because I assume there's a column of rebel fighters walking along our perimeter or something. I'm straining my eyes trying to make out any kind of shape in the darkness. But when I see a small point of light moving right to left in the jungle in front of me, it was pretty far in the distance and kind of bobbed up and down. I assume it's a lantern and keep watching till it passes out of view, maybe 50 meters in front of me. As soon as it's gone, the noise in the jungle picks up back again, like everything suddenly woke up. The next day I tell the instructors through the interpreter, and they laugh. I ask if it's bad guys. Maybe they should pass out ammo, but nope. They just say something to the effect of, nothing to worry about, but just don't go near the lights. Towards the end of our 3 weeks in the jungle, I'm tired as fuck and hungry as fuck. I've been wet and miserable for weeks on end, and I just want to go back to the camp and sleep in a bed. I'm on guard duty again when the same thing happens. Sound slowly goes away, then the lights in the jungle. This time there are multiple, all different colors, yellow, white, green, and red. It's like a town hall meeting. The lights just do this weird bobbing up and down, going up trees, then coming back down the other side. I swear I hear voices, like people talking, but it's muffled. It was super eerie. Again, the lights just fade off into the distance, all going in separate directions, and everything returns to normal. We leave the jungle the next 2 days later, and I've never wanted to go back there since. So I mentioned previously about how at one point decapitated bodies were showing up daily in the sector. Most of the time we found them slumped over in the middle of predominant sections, or in front of one church in the sector. Our COP was a Catholic seminary that had been occupied and fortified after the cardinal was dragged into the street, shot, decapitated, and immolated. Across the street from our tiny base was a Catholic church run by an old priest we called Yoda. He was super friendly and always helped us out with info. He used to push food and tea on us every time a patrol stopped by. He also ran the religious services we started up for Christians in the company. He was a super sweet old guy, and one night, some men broke into his church, took him out into the street, and they killed him. After that, we started running more patrols and night ops to try and catch the guys who did it. One morning, a platoon got into a car chase with a group of men. They were trying to flee out of the sector when we called a helicopter in to support, and it shot the car up. One of the guys died inside the car. When we found him, he had melted into his seat. All that was left was a charred corpse. His eyes had burst from the heat of the blaze and were running down his cheeks. His body was laying in the street 50 meters from the burned hulk of the car. He had literally been blown out of his shoes. They were still on the road with his feet in them. The third guy had run off into the thick bush that lined the Tigris River. The helicopter shot about 30 missiles into the bush in an attempt to flush him out, but all it did was set the forest on fire. We found his body 2 days later, burned to a crisp, curled in the fetal position. We also found a single hut away out there. We'd have never known it existed if the forest hadn't burnt it away. Inside was a pile of human heads arranged in a pyramid shape. It was like a nightmare from Heart of Darkness. The heads on the bottom were decomposed enough that they were basically skulls, empty smiles leering at us. They got progressively fresher towards the top of the pile. Near the top was the weak old head of Yoda, the priest from across the street. I can't fathom the brutality that would lead a human to do this to another person. It was, without a doubt, one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life.